Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video we're going to do a few things. First, we're going to add some new routes to our app.js in order to allow us to create comments, and then we're going to create a comments.new.ejs file that's going to allow us to show a form so that users can create a new comment. So we're here inside of our Yelp clone, and then we have pulled up app.js. So let's scroll down to the bottom of our routes, right below our last comic route, and let's go ahead and add some routes to make comments. Now real quickly, I want to reference this RESTful routing again, and right now we have, if you remember, we have the big 7, such as /item/item/new. The way that we're going to handle routes is we're going to use nested routes. So basically, right now we've got /items to get the index, and then if we're showing that item, it'd be /item/id. What we're going to end up doing is, for creating comments, we're going to do the same type of thing, except it's going to be after this. So to give you an example, let's get some space here so we can kind of look without all the distractions. Let's add a comment here so we can just kind of play around. As it sits right now, whenever we have a new comic route, that route is to /comics/new. And if we know that, because we can look up here and where is it? There it is, /comics/new. If we're going to actually create the comic, it's going to be a post to over here /comics. So we have the get /comics/new, and then we have a post to /comics. And this one is the new route, and this one is the create route. This one shows the form. This one actually creates the thing in the database. We're going to do the exact same thing with our comments. So let's say this is comics. So comments, we're going to do the same thing. Get, and it's going to be /comments/new. And then for our post /comments. But the catch with this, that's our create route. But the catch with this is we need to make sure that these comments are associated with specific comics, because we're not just going to have a giant database of comments that are just floating out there, not ever associated with a comic. All of the comments will be associated with exactly one comic. So what we're going to do is we're going to use nested routes. So instead of just doing /comments/new, we're actually going to do /comics/id /comments/new. And we're going to do the same thing with the post /comics/id. So we're basically nesting these, just like you can nest your directories inside of each other. We're nesting our routes inside of each other. This comment/new is going to be nested inside comics ID, because whenever we show this form, we want to make sure that we include this comic information. Whenever we actually create the comment, we want to make sure that it's created for that one comic. So in the URL, we have to include that information, or we can include it in the body, but we're going to include it in the URL. So that is an example of nested routes. So you basically just take the exact same things you're doing here and just append it to the item/ID. This may still be confusing for some of you, and that's fine, because we're going to actually build it out and you'll see exactly how that works. So let's get rid of all this extra space that we created. And we're going to do app.get, because this is going to be the form. This is going to be the new comment show form. Because on the new one we show the form, on the create we actually create it. Create comment, actually update the database. So inside of this app.get, we're going to do /comments/id /comment/new. That's going to be the final route. Request response, and then we got to figure out what we're going to do to actually show the form. So really, that's a simple one. res.render comment_new, passing in the ID. And in our model, what did we call it? Because it's good to keep this We called it comic ID, so we're going to pass in comic ID, and that's going to be request.params.id. That's coming from right here. So we're going to render a page, which we haven't created yet. We haven't created this page yet, but passing in the ID. The reason we're passing in the ID is so that we can use that ID in our form and make sure that it submits to the correct one. So our next step is to actually create that inside of our views folder. So touch views / comments _ new.ejs. So now that we have this EJS file, the first thing we want to do always is to include partials / header. Duplicate that and include the footer. So I'm just going to bang out a very quick, simple, ugly form. It's going to use Bootstrap, so it's not going to be horribly ugly, but it is not going to be the best form in the world, and we can always update this later. So div class equals container, because you always want that, or almost always want that whenever you're using Bootstrap. So let's do an h1 add new comment. And then we'll have our form. Form action equals, and we'll deal with that in a second, method is going to equal post. Inside the form, we're going to have a div where the class equals form group. Because remember, you want your label and your input inside of this div, and whenever you're using Bootstrap. So label for, and this is going to be user, because remember in our comment, three things we need are user, text, and comic ID. That's going to be username, and then the input type is going to be text, name is going to be user, ID is going to be user, class is going to be form control. I'm going to put a placeholder equals username. Now, obviously, you don't want to ask people to put in their username whenever they're submitting a comment. This is just something we're adding right now because we don't have authentication in place yet. Once we add authentication, we're going to come back and get rid of this input and just have it have the username be done automatically. We also want this to be required, and we want to autofocus to it to make it a little bit easier to use. And that's it for that div. Our next div is also going to be form group. And inside of there, we're going to have another label for text, because that's the second part that we need. Comment text. And then instead of an input, we're going to have text area. That way it's a little bit bigger and easier to do. Text area class equals form control, as always, whenever you're using Bootstrap. Name equals text, ID equals text. And now we have to give it the kind of the default values for our text area. So we want rows equals 8, 8. Calls for columns equals 80. Placeholder equals comment text here, and also make that required. And then we're going to do a little trick, because right now, this form, when we submit it, we have to pass in the ID for that, for the comic. So for example, we need the ID for the comic that this comment is going to apply to. This trick is oftentimes used whenever you want to pass information into the body of a form, but you don't actually want the user to populate that information. So it's something you need to use on the back end, but you don't want your user to have to put it in, or you don't want your user to even see it. You can add a hidden input. Input type equals hidden. Name, name equals comic ID. And then the value is where you put in whatever you want it to say. So we want our value to come from this right here, this comic ID. We're passing in the request.params.id with the name of comic ID. So we want this to be our EJS tags, so equals comic ID. And the last thing we have to do is update the action. We haven't built this route yet, so this form's not going to work quite yet, but we do know what the route's going to be. The route is going to be /comics /ID, and we're going to have to update that in a second, /comments. Because remember, our post route, our create comment route, is going to be /comics /ID /comment, and it's going to be a post route. So right now our ID, we can't put that there because that won't work. It'll actually try to submit to that URL and it will break and it will not work. So we have to populate that ID from here. And fortunately, we're passing this in as comic ID. So we just use the exact same thing we did down here. We can just copy and paste that up there. Now let's save. And before we actually test this, let's go ahead and create a basic route here. app.post to /comics/ID/comments. And this needs to be plural. Fail. Request response. And all we're going to do is response.send hit the new or the create comment route. We're not actually going to do anything with it right now. So let's save that. And our comments.new, let's make sure that's saved. So now we can no daemon and test this out. Get the running page. That can go away. So right now, I actually did an update on this in one of the future videos, so the information in the database is slightly different than what we're doing now. So the pictures don't actually work. So if I click on this, everything works except the picture because I changed something. So just be aware that that is coming. This is not something broken. Yours should still show the pictures and should work fine. So we need to go to comics/ID/comments/new. And here's our form, username, comment text. Now you'll notice we don't see that hidden input. It's still here. If we open up the dev console and look at the elements, you can see that inside of container, inside of form, you have a hidden input. So you don't want to use this for anything that could be nefarious if anybody found out about this. You don't want to use this for any private information or anything like that because people can still see it. It's still there, it's just not rendered to the screen. But it's very useful in our case. So let's do our username. Doesn't really matter. And I never added a submit button, so I can't even submit this form. So let's go back and fix that real quick. Let's add a button. Type equals submit. Class equals btn and btn primary. That'll give it a nice little blue color. We'll say submit comment. So save and then refresh this page. Now we have this nice thing. So username, whatever, comment text, whatever, submit, and we actually hit the route that we wanted to hit. Perfect, that's what we want. So we know that our new comment form, both the new comment and the form are working as intended. So now we just need to build out the logic to actually create the form. I'll give myself a little bit of space. So instead of just res.send, we need to actually create the logic to make the comment. To do that, we need to make sure that we are importing comment up here, because remember we've created our model, but we're never actually importing it yet, so we can't use it. So const comment equals require ./models/comment. Let's scroll down again. So the first thing we're going to do is create the comment. Then we are going to redirect to the show page for that comic, or for the comic, because it's not that comment, but it's the comic that it goes with. So let's actually create the comment. Comment.create. And inside of here, we need to pass the same three things that we gave our model. So let's look at our model real quick. User, text, and comic ID. So user is going to be request.body.user. Text is going to be request.body.text. And comic ID is going to be request.body.comic.id. For those of you who know ES6 pretty well, there is a faster, easier way to do this, but I'm just wanting to make it as explicit as possible. So after that is done, .then, we're going to be received back the new comment as an item. I don't think we're actually going to use it, but I do want to log it. Console.log. New comment, just so we can see it in the console. We're going to remove this before we actually do any type of production. And then we're going to res.redirect back to /comics/request.body.comic ID, because that's going to be the ID of the comic. If that doesn't work, .catch console.log the error, and res.redirect, actually just write back. It's going to be the exact same thing. So either way, we're going back to that page, whether we were able to create the comment or not. So let's save that, see if it has any errors. Does not, works fine. So let's go back here, and here's our username and our comment text. Let's submit that comment and see if it works. Looks like it was submitted. We're not showing it, but let's log into Atlas and see. So I've logged into Atlas. Let me click on collections, comments, and there we go. We got our comment put in there. You'll see that it is associated with that comment, with that comic rather. I don't want to update anything, but we've got user and the text, and if we look in our console, we see it as well. In our terminal, we got the ID there, user, text, and the comic ID that it's associated with. One thing that I just want to point out real quick is that this type is an object ID. It's not a string. These are strings. This is an actual object ID. Even though we submitted a string back here in our right here, this is a string. What we're submitting here is a string, request.body.comic ID. If we log the type of it, it would be a string. However, because in our model we set it up with the type right here, Mongoose will convert it to an object ID for us. That way we don't have to deal with that. In this video, we did a few things. We talked about nested routes and how we're going to nest the actual routes for the comments inside of the routes for the comics. Notice that these still follow RESTful routing conventions. To create a new one, you're still sending a post request to /item. It's just nested inside of these others. To show the form for the new form, you're still sending a GET request to /item/new. It's just nested inside of this other one. So you still follow RESTful routing conventions. You just nest it inside of your other routes. We created two routes for our comments, the one to show the form and one to actually create it. Those are our new and our create routes as they are applied to comments. We created a basic view to show the comment form right there, comments_new. That way it allows users to submit actual comments. As part of that, we used a hidden input. That's not required. You could have just used the request.params.id, but I wanted to show you that because it's a very useful little trick that you can use in your HTML forms. And when we create these new comments, it creates a comic ID that is of the type object ID, even though we are submitting a string because of how we set up the model. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to help. Thanks.